This lesson will allow us, for the first time in the course, to read a paragraph by Bion. It is from the book Learning from Experience, and in parallel we will pause and relate it to the terms we studied during this lesson. Bion writes, "An infant capable of tolerating frustration can permit itself to have a sense of reality, to be dominated by the reality principle. If its tolerance of frustration reaches beyond a certain degree, omnipotent mechanisms come into operation, notably projective identification." This, the use of projective identification, might still be regarded as realistic in that it suggests an awareness of the value of a capacity for thought as a means of softening frustration when the reality principle is dominant. It means that there is still hope that somewhere there is an awareness that can meet anguish, meet reality, face reality, soften it, temper it. But it depends for its efficacy, the efficacy of the projective identification mechanism, on the existence of the mother's capacity for reverie, the capacity to take in, tolerate, and think. Not to think intellectually, but to take inward, into the mind, the body, stay with and contemplate until something begins to be modified. If the mother fails, then a further burden is thrown on the infant's capacity for toleration of frustration. For now, its capacity for toleration of frustration of thought itself is tested. Here, we imagine the unmelted metals outside beginning to be thrown back towards the room itself. It is the very instrument of thought, the very mental apparatus, that is at risk, causing an acute sense of destruction. I'm here supposing that projective identification is an early form of that which later is called capacity for thinking. In Bion's view, thought depends on a creative encounter between two components, thoughts and an apparatus that develops to think them. Projective identification is a primary model that represents such a creative encounter between two components, the baby's beta elements and the mother's alpha function. If this encounter is successful, the baby can internalize it and its ability to think develops. And here Bion marks two extreme possibilities. He writes, "An infant endowed with a marked capacity for toleration of frustration might survive the ordeal of a mother incapable of reverie and therefore incapable of supplying its mental needs. At the other extreme, an infant markedly incapable of tolerating frustration cannot survive without breakdown even an experience of projective identification with a mother capable of reverie. Nothing less than unceasing breastfeeding would serve, and that is not possible through lack of appetite if for no other reason. Because there is a congenital core of the ability to tolerate frustration here, as if we were born with a certain potency of the congenital crucible, an infant who is born without this ability, even if it has a very good, very supportive, very sensitive mother who knows how to read it, his entry into reality will be experienced as a kind of crisis. It will not be able to overcome it without a sense of crisis, of destruction. We can also imagine these two different infants. There are children who for them any pain, any discomfort is conscious in them all the time. They cannot be indifferent to it. They do not have an instrument that can contain it. They scream all the time as if they were saying, "It hurts, it hurts, it hurts." It's like when we have an ingrown toenail That's how you experience reality. Or when someone who has a very strong musical sensitivity enters a concert and there's an instrument playing a little out of tune. Another person with less sensitivity enjoys the concert, but for this person, they're constantly aware that the instrument is out of tune and they suffer. So these congenital differences at the level of sensitivity of different senses have a powerful influence on the existential experience of the child, the infant, the developing person. If contact with reality is experienced as intolerable, it puts a load on the instruments that it is not possible to carry. Reality is simply unbearable and hated. Contrary to a person who has moderate instruments and senses, more adapted to the range of reality, and can experience the entrance of reality as something that is more pleasant, that nourishes him, that is not intolerable. There's a fine line here between very different existential experiences that, according to Bion, depend on something very primary in the ability to tolerate frustration. This fine line determines whether the entrance of reality is experienced as nourishing milk or as a ruthless stoning force. In this context, Dr. Eigen writes, Bion determines a hair-thin difference between creative and destructive theories. The life and death of the mind are in danger. It's a very dramatic description. From this difference between the two children that Bion describes and which we can imagine, it is possible to speak somewhat differently about Klein's concept of envy, and I really like the way envy was translated in Hebrew as narrow eye, tzarut ayin. This is a fascinating description as it can describe to us how Klein's envy is like a lens with a very narrow scope. Instead of looking wide, look narrow. In other words, we can imagine a child whose range of attention is occupied all the time at the point of injury, the point of destruction, the point of entry into reality, the point of discomfort, like we said, like an ingrown toenail. It's possible to look at envy as an uninterrupted focus on the uncomfortable part, on the no-thing, something that does not enable rest. Contrarily, to a child for whom the something that bothers is only a part of something broader than the stimulus, he doesn't focus all the time on that. There's a complete set of stimuli, and among them, there's also the point of discomfort. It is a very important difference that depends on envy, on a narrow gaze. But it is also a matter of identification with that. That is to say, there are people who feel that they themselves are the discomfort. When there is discomfort, they themselves are uncomfortable. And there are people whose mental container is broader. Again, they can appreciate the discomfort not from a place that identifies with it, but as a stimulus that exists among other stimuli. If we talk a little bit about mindfulness, the practice of mindfulness supports or can support the ability to not completely identify with the points of discomfort. That is to say, there are also, among all other stimuli of discomfort. But this flow of uncomfortable experience is like only one video channel. It is an experiential channel that goes through us, but it is not us. We are a certain consciousness or something broader that contains that experiential flow.